From a dengue webinar series, Richard Boone Camino, MD, September 26, 2024, The Case for Dengue Immunization by Tomas Jelinek, MD. World Evidence for Licensed Dengue Vaccines by Julio Crota, MD. Managing Expectations of the Dengue Vaccine by Ng Yang O, MD, PhD. One, The Case for Dengue Immunization by Tomas Jelinek, MD, Monday, February 24, 2025. Dengue has emerged as a major threat, as a pandemic actually, and the World Health Organization, WHO, this year talked of a dramatic increase of numbers in many endemic countries. The maps from earlier this year showed, especially, increases in Latin America and in Southeast Asia and Latin America. The Pan American Health Organization showed for the first 31 weeks of the year, 11 million suspected dengue cases. This is a number we never had before. It's the highest it's ever been seen and about 6,290 deaths. Fortunately, the case fatality rate in dengue is low, but the pressure on the health systems in affected countries is great because the numbers of patients are so dramatic, and they are increasing year after year. Similar, not quite as dramatic, has been an increase in numbers in Southeast Asia, especially in countries like Malaysia, Cambodia, and others. For the first weeks of the year, dengue numbers decreased a little bit, and even Singapore, which has been priding itself with strict dengue control measures, saw an increase in the first weeks of 2024. The vector is spreading. Aedes tiger mosquitoes are benefiting from urbanization. They follow humans and breed in cities and in human habitations, in particular in slums. So, we see an increase in many countries, and we also see an increase of spread of Aedes, especially Aedes albopictus, in Europe. Now vector control, controlling the mosquitoes, is not easy because, as I said, the mosquito is following humans, and it likes what we do with the landscape, building cities, and it's breeding there, so it's very difficult to control. The amount of infections has been increasing in returning travelers, and dengue is by now one of the most important vaccine-preventable infections in travelers, right after influenza and COVID and cruise ships. And also, if we look at the impact of the disease and the incidence, dengue is one of the most important diseases we see as risk for travelers, and therefore we need personal protection measures. And we just see that mosquito control is not enough to induce personal protection. Therefore, we need an opportunity to vaccinate. The amount of infections has been increasing in returning travelers, and dengue is by now one of the most important vaccine-preventable infections in travelers, right after influenza and COVID and cruise ships. And also, if we look at the impact of the disease and the incidence, dengue is one of the most important diseases we see as risk for travelers, and therefore we need personal protection measures. And we just see that mosquito control is not enough to induce personal protection. Therefore, we need an opportunity to vaccinate. And so, summing all this up, an effective protection against dengue is important for European travelers and in the long term for European potential transmission areas as well. And, therefore, we have a few options. We can stop the travel, which is totally unrealistic, of course. We can try to diminish mosquito bites by protection, which never gives a complete protection, of course, and we can use vaccination, which doesn't give a complete protection either but is, in the moment, the best option we have. And so, summing all this up, an effective protection against dengue is important for European travelers and in the long term for European potential transmission areas as well. And, therefore, we have a few options. We can stop the travel, which is totally unrealistic, of course. We can try to diminish mosquito bites by protection, which never gives a complete protection, of course, and we can use vaccination, which doesn't give a complete protection either but is, in the moment, the best option we have. 2. Julio Crota, MD, PhD. Hello, I'm Julio Crota, Professor of Medicine at Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul and Yale School of Public Health and researcher at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Campo Grande. Real-world evidence for licensed dengue vaccines. Real-world evidence for licensed dengue vaccines. By Julio Crota, MD, PhD. You have 2 licensed dengue vaccines. One, it's CIT-DV, and another, TAC-003, both with live attenuated vaccine have the 4 serotypes. The difference is the backbone. The CIT-DV, it's a yellow fever backbone. TAC-003 is a DENV2 backbone. Both have a license in several countries. You have a different dose regimen for CIT-DV. You have 3 doses given 6 months apart. In TAC-003, it's 2 doses, 3 months apart. It's good to point out that CIT-DV is just discontinued, and the company announced this year, and this is the only European Union vaccine that is licensed in the US. This makes problems for the future. TAC-003 was licensed in different countries but not in the US. The TAC-003 you can use for seropositive and seronegative individuals. CIT-DV, it's only for seropositive individuals. Regarding efficacy and safety of dengue vaccine, CIT-DV and TAC-003 have a high efficacy and protects especially several outcomes, hospitalization, and the discontinued vaccine has a lower protection against serotype 1 and 2 compared to the 3 and 4, and also to understand that you didn't have data regarding efficacy against serotype 4 for TAC-003, and it didn't have any increase in the risk of severe disease hospitalization in seronegative individuals in the clinical trial in the TAC-003. The 2 vaccines have similar side effects. The most common side effects are injection site pain and headache. Efficacy and safety of licensed dengue vaccines. Both CIT-DV and TAC-003 are highly efficacious in protecting against severe outcomes including hospitalization and dengue. CIT-DV, lower protection against VCD from serotypes DENV1 and DENV-2 than from DENV-3 and DENV4. Please note, VCD refers to virologically confirmed dengue, a term used to describe dengue cases confirmed through laboratory testing, and is a key outcome measured in dengue vaccine efficacy studies. TAC-003, no efficacy demonstrated against DENV, no increased risk 3 in seronegative individuals, not enough cases to assess DENV4, no increased risk or severe disease in seronegative individuals. The 2 vaccines have similar AE, the most common being injection site pain and headache. An adverse event following immunization, EFI, is defined as any untoward medical occurrence following immunization which does not necessarily have a causal relationship to the vaccine. The adverse event may be any unfavorable or unintended sign, abnormal laboratory finding, symptom or disease. You have a new vaccine that is under development. It's a Butantan dengue vaccine that single dose prevents symptomatic dengue 1 and dengue 2 and just came this year. The data regarding the long follow-up, 3.7 years, and this vaccine you have a decrease of DENV2 protection. This is important because in this vaccine you didn't have a backbone of DENV2, a backbone of DENV1, -3, and -4. It didn't have any data regarding DENV3 and DENV4 because it didn't coordinate the clinical trial, and the safety is similar to other vaccines. You have some limitations in respect of clinical trials, especially the efficacy of different serotypes. We already commented on this. In conclusion, it's good to understand that you have limited data regarding efficacy against different serotypes, especially in the seronegative for TAC003, for DENV3 and DENV4, and for the Butantan vaccine, they don't have any data. You have limited power to analyze the antibody-dependent enhancement because the outcome is not very frequent, hospitalization after the vaccination, and also you have limited power to analyze the higher adverse events. We already show in Brazil the anaphylactic data that was reported in the clinical trial studies. The duration of protection is limited to follow-up studies that we already have. The safety of protection, especially for the elderly, is very important to produce this data in real-world studies, and you need more data about the one-dose protection, especially for TAC003. It's important to continue to perform this real-world study to understand better this important point. Expert insights on clinical limitations of clinical dengue vaccines. Efficacy against different serotypes. TAC003, not enough cases to assess DENV3 Butantan, not enough cases to assess DENV3 and DENV4. Limited power to analyze AD. TAC003, no increased risk for severe disease or hospitalization in seronegative individuals. Butantan, hospitalization is not the outcome evaluated. Limited power to analyze rare AD. TAC003, most common AE were injection site pain and headache. Butantan, hospitalization was not the outcome evaluated. Limited power to analyze AD. TAC003, most common ADE were injection site pain and headache. Butantan, TAC003, most common ADE were injection site pain and headache. Duration of protection. TAC003 4 to 5 years. Butantan 3 to 7 years. Safety protection in different age group. TAC003 4 to 60 years old. Butantan 2 to 59 years old. Dengue vaccine in development. Butantan DV ongoing phase 3. Kindly note, not currently licensed as of September 2024. Single dose prevented symptomatic DENV1 and DENV2 in children. No DENV3 and DENV4 cases occurred. No safety concerns identified. Nyong'o, MD, PhD. Hello, I'm Nyong'o, professor in the program in emerging infectious diseases at the Duke NUS Medical School in Singapore. Welcome to this last chapter titled Managing Expectations of the Dengue Vaccine. Why is vaccination important? I think essentially you would have heard from the others in this series on where vaccine development is at in the world. I think the case for dengue vaccine is perhaps very well illustrated by the experience in Singapore. Now, obviously, because dengue is transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, then if you lower the Aedes aegypti mosquito population, then technically and theoretically, it should lead to dengue control, and indeed, that was the experience in Singapore. In the dengue history in Singapore, it can perhaps be divided up very nicely into 3 phases. The first phase was in the 1960s, when epidemic dengue first emerged in Singapore, where every 3 to 5 years, we had epidemics of dengue, and because of these epidemics, the Ministry of Health of Singapore decided to control the mosquito population. So starting from about 1970, they implemented a series of control measures that's directed at reducing the available breeding habitats for mosquitoes, so that over time, the mosquito population plunged to the extent that between 1975 to, towards the end of 1980s, there was no outbreak in Singapore despite outbreaks everywhere else in Southeast Asia, and that illustrates feasibility of mosquito control as a way of reducing the dengue burden. However, reducing mosquitoes would also lead to reducing virus transmission in the population. Hence, over time, between 1970 to the early 1990s, the population that grew up in Singapore became less and less immune to dengue, such that starting from the early 1990s, epidemic dengue re-emerged in Singapore such that we now have epidemics once every 7 to 9 years. So that illustrates, therefore, the need for somehow incorporating measures that elevate the immunity levels in Singapore whilst we suppress the mosquito population. My personal opinion, I think that if the Philippines is to mitigate the impending dengue rise in cases, we need to add an effective vaccine for our situation. Reasons why: cleaning the environment from collection of water breeding sites. 1. Now vector control. Controlling the mosquitoes is not easy because, as was mentioned by Dr. Tomas Jelinek, the mosquito is following humans, and it likes what we do with the landscape, building cities, and it's breeding there, so it's very difficult to control too. It was pointed out these Aedes mosquitoes follow humans. Hence, we must consider migratory aspects of dengue. 3. Cleaning the environment is an excellent idea but may only be a temporary solution, as was pointed Aedes mosquito follows humans. Hence, we may be cleaning the possible breeding sites but the sites are merely relocated. 4. The tremendous rainfall of the Philippine archipelago is around 2,348 millimeters with climate change. It might be March 2025, but we are still receiving rainfall sufficient to create breeding sites. From Climate of the Philippines, Pagasa Website 5. Hence, the cleaning of possible mosquito water breeding sites must be a continuous process every 7 to 10 days. When a mosquito had developed into an adult mosquito of an Aedes aegypti. Source: Life Cycle of Aedes Mosquitoes, CDC website. My suggestions: 1. I suggest that the Infectious Diseases section of DOH and Medical Infectious Diseases medical societies in the Philippines, like Philippine Society for Microbiology and Infectious Diseases, suggest a medical test to determine previous serotype of dengue infection, spike serotype of previous dengue infection epidemic in that region, to determine the current serotype and to recommend a suitable dengue vaccine, if ever, to the current dengue rise in cases. This is to prevent antibody-dependent enhancement as the dreadful memory of 2016 which resulted deaths. Source: The Dengue Vaccine Dilemma by Chris Lowe, December 16, 2019. AD occurs when the antibodies generated during an immune response recognize and bind to a pathogen, but they are unable to prevent infection. Instead, these antibodies act as a Trojan horse, allowing the pathogen to get into cells and exacerbate the immune response. The ID section of DOH and Infectious Diseases societies are requested to recommend effective dengue vaccines, if agreeable to DOH section and ID societies. DOH Bawat Buhay Mahalaga, a social media-based physician coordinated patient navigation system to protect patients with comorbidities from common health issues and endemic COVID, will answer inquiries about dengue and other medical health problems such as hypertension, diabetes mellitus, heat-related illness, non-emergency health issues, etc. DOH Bawat Buhay Mahalaga will then activate its patient online navigation system and refer the patient to primary care health services that the patient may need.